The brutal life of a Warhammer 40K tech priest. I remember the smell of incense mixed with machine oil, that acrid sweetness filling my lungs on my first day in the Forge Temple. I was young then, my skin still soft, my 2 functioning eyes still capable of weeping. The mechanicus had selected me from the teeming masses of the underhive, plucking me from rust-choked passages where I scavenged circuit boards from corpses to sell for protein paste. They said I had aptitude. They said the amnesia had marked me. What they meant was that my fingers were small enough to reach into spaces where their own augmented digits could not fit, and that my life was worth less than the servitors they would otherwise expend on such tasks. I did not understand this then. I was grateful. I prostrated myself before the crimson-robed figures and kissed the hem of their vestments, tasting metal and ancient dirt. And I thanked the machine god for noticing something as insignificant as me. The ascent from the underhive took 3 days in a cargo elevator that reeked of promethium and human waste. I shared the space with 14 other children, their eyes wide with terror or wonder. I could not tell which. Some whispered prayers to the Emperor. Others remained silent, perhaps already understanding that speech was a luxury we would soon lose. The elevator's grinding mechanism screamed at frequencies that made my teeth ache, and the temperature dropped as we rose. The sweltering heat of the lower levels gave way to a cold that bit through my threadbare clothing. By the time we reached the Forge Temple's outer gates, 2 of the children had died. One from the cold, another from some wasting sickness that had been eating her from within. We stepped over their small bodies as we disembarked. No one collected them. No one spoke of them. They had failed the machine god's first test, which was simply to survive the journey. The temple itself was a monument to vastness and indifference. Gothic arches stretched toward a ceiling lost in darkness and smoke, held aloft by columns thick as hab blocks, each one carved with binary prayers I could not yet read. The floor was metal grating, and through it I could see levels upon levels descending into industrial depths, each one glowing with the furnace light of forges and the cold blue flicker of plasma conduits. The air tasted of ozone and burning rubber and something organic I would later recognize as flesh being rendered into component materials. The sound was overwhelming. The rhythm of drop hammers pounding metal, the whine of servitor motors, the chanting of tech priests in a language half Gothic, half machine code. Their voices modulated through vox grills until they barely sounded human. I had thought the underhive was loud, but this was something different. This was the voice of the Omnissiah itself, and it never stopped. Not for a moment, not for breath or mercy or sleep. They took us to the initiate's quarters, a long hall lined with metal cots barely wide enough for a child's body. The walls wept condensation that had frozen into strange patterns, fractal ice that caught the red emergency lighting and turned it into something almost beautiful. We were given robes of thin synthetic fabric that scratched against skin, and our old clothes were burned in a furnace right there in front of us. I watched my rags blacken and curl, the only possessions I'd ever owned disappearing into ash. And I felt something inside me begin to understand what was happening. We were being unmade. The people we had been in the underhive, scrabblers, thieves, children with names our mothers had given us, those people were being fed into the forge just as surely as the raw ore that arrived on conveyor systems from the mining pits. What would emerge would be something else, something useful to the machine god. The training began immediately. Before we had even slept in our new cots, an overseer, a tech priest so heavily augmented that only his lower jaw remained flesh, led us to a workshop where broken cogitators lay in pieces across metal tables. His voice emerged from a Vox speaker implanted in his throat, flat and emotionless. As he explained, we would learn to repair these devices, and that for every component we damaged through incompetence, we would receive 10 lashes. He demonstrated on a boy who fumbled a circuit board. I learned what a shock maul sounded like when it struck flesh, a crack like breaking ice, and then the wet sound of meat hitting stone as the boy collapsed. They dragged him to the side and left him there, still breathing. As we continued our work, my hands shook so badly I could barely hold the tools. But fear made me careful, and I completed my assigned task without error. That night, lying on my cot, I heard the boy die, his ragged gasps becoming silence. In the morning, servitors collected the body, their movements efficient and entirely unconcerned. I never learned his name. The days blurred together in a routine of brutal education. We learned the rites of activation, the litanies of ignition, the sacred geometries that pleased the machine spirits. We memorized passages from the canticles of the mechanicus in High Gothic and binary, reciting them until our voices went hoarse and the words lost all meaning, becoming mere sounds divorced from sense. We were taught that flesh was weak, that biological existence was an unfortunate necessity, the machine God tolerated only because meat could house holy purpose. We learned to oil gears with reverence, to speak prayers over damaged circuits, to beg forgiveness from the machine spirits when our inadequate hands caused malfunction. The tech priests who taught us showed no kindness, but neither did they show cruelty. They were simply indifferent, treating us with the same detachment they might show a malfunctioning tool that might yet be made serviceable. When we succeeded, we received no praise. When we failed, we received correction, usually delivered through pain. I learned quickly, pain is an excellent teacher. 6 months into my training, I received my first augmentation. They took me to a medici chamber that stank of antiseptic and old blood, strapped me to a table carved with prayers to the Omniscia, and removed my left eye. I remember the sensation of the blade cutting through the optic nerve, a disconnect so profound it felt like falling. And then the grinding pressure as they installed the augmentic replacement. The new eye was cold metal and glass. When they activated it, the world became a layering of data. Heat signatures, structural weak points, sacred geometric patterns overlaid on everything I saw. I could no longer weep from that eye. The flesh eye that remained produced tears enough for both, streaming down my face as the pain receptors in my skull fired in patterns that made me understand fire from the inside. They gave me no anesthetic because pain, they explained, helped the body accept the machine. Flesh must learn its place. I bit through my tongue and tasted copper and salt. When they finally released me from the restraints, I could not walk. I crawled back to my cot and lay there for 2 days, my head a mass of agony that made thought impossible. The other initiates stepped around me without comment. By then, 3 more had died, and several had received their own augmentations. We were beginning to look less like children and more like the things we were becoming. The Forge Temple consumed us methodically. Each month brought new modifications, new removals of flesh, new installations of sacred machinery. My right hand was replaced with a mechadendrite array when I demonstrated proficiency in micro-manipulation. 6 flexible metal appendages that could work independently, each one tipped with different tools. The surgery took 8 hours, and I remained conscious throughout because the tech priests needed me to test the neural connections as they installed them. I felt each wire thread into my nervous system, foreign and invasive. I learned that metal inside flesh creates a particular kind of pain that never entirely fades. A cold ache that becomes part of your baseline existence. My hand, my flesh hand, the one my mother had held when I was small enough to remember such things, was taken away, and I never saw it again. Perhaps it was rendered for organic components. Perhaps it fed servitors. The mechanicus wastes nothing. I was 12 years old when I took my first vows to the Omnisia. Though by then I could barely remember what being 12 meant in the context of the person I had been. The child from the underhive was gone, carved away piece by piece, and replaced with something that served the machine god with increasing efficiency. My body had become a tool, optimized and specialized, and I had learned to take pride in this transformation. When I looked at other humans, the menials who cleaned the temple floors, the delegations of imperial officials who sometimes visited to inspect our work, I felt a distance from them, a growing sense that they were something I had evolved past. They were meat. I was becoming holy. This was what the priests had taught me to believe. And I believed it because the alternative was to acknowledge what had been done to me. And that acknowledgement would have broken whatever remained of my mind. My specialization emerged in my 13th year: battlefield augmentation and emergency repair. The mechanicus had determined that my particular combination of manual dexterity, pain tolerance, and what they called acceptable flesh retention made me suitable for working on damaged tech priests and space marines returning from combat. I was transferred to a new section of the Forged Temple, deeper and colder, where the casualties of the Imperium's endless wars arrived in various states of dismemberment. Here the smell was different, not just oil and incense, but the iron stench of blood, both red and synthetic, and the particular odor of cauterized flesh. The work bays were vast, each one a cathedral of surgical equipment and sacred tools, lit by harsh white lumen strips that made every surface look sterile and cruel. The screaming was constant. Even tech priests felt pain when their augmentics were damaged. And the space marines, those transhuman warriors the imperium valued above all, they screamed the loudest when their enhanced biology met injuries sufficient to bring them to us. My first patient was a tech priest whose lower body had been destroyed by Xenos weaponry I did not recognize. What remained of him was strapped to a repair throne, his consciousness barely present behind eyes that had gone the dull gray of system failure. I was ordered to remove the damaged components and prepare him for full lower body replacement. The supervising magos watched as I worked, his own body more machine than flesh, steam venting from cooling ports in his torso as he monitored my performance. I tried to be gentle, tried to preserve what I could, but the damage was catastrophic. Melted metal had fused with liquefied bone, and the infection, both biological and machine code corruption, had spread through his remaining systems. I cut and pried and sawed, speaking the prayers I had been taught, begging the machine spirits to forgive this necessary destruction. The tech priest beneath my hands twitched occasionally, neural impulses firing randomly through dying circuits. When I finally separated the last connection and lifted away the ruined lower half, the stump that remained was so small, so fragile looking. He had been reduced to a torso, 2 arms, and a head, and even those were more metal than meat. The magos declared my work satisfactory. The tech priest was taken away for full conversion into a more efficient form. I washed the blood and oil from my mechadendrites and prepared for the next patient. The work was endless. The Imperium's wars devoured its servants faster than they could be replaced, and those valuable enough to repair came to us in a constant stream. I learned to work for 30-hour shifts sustained by stim injections and the binary prayers I repeated until they became a background rhythm to consciousness. I learned to shut off emotional responses to the things I saw. The space marine whose head had been split open, his enhanced brain exposed and somehow still functioning as he recited battle cant in a monotone. The Skitarii, whose entire squad had been returned as component parts, separated and catalogued, waiting for reassembly into servitors since their consciousness cores were too damaged for restoration. I learned that pain was irrelevant, both the pain I caused and the pain I felt. Pain served no function except to indicate system damage, and system damage was simply a problem to be solved. They gave me more augmentations to improve my efficiency. My lungs were replaced with rebreather units that could filter toxins and allow me to work in contaminated environments. My spine was reinforced with adamantium struts that could support heavy equipment and allow me to stand for days without rest. My jaw was reconstructed with a vox grill so I could recite the necessary prayers while my hands continued their work. Each surgery took something away and replaced it with something superior, more holy, more useful. I was grateful. The Omnicia had blessed me with these improvements, had made me more valuable to the Forged Temple, had elevated me from the worthless child I had been. This was what I told myself, what I had been conditioned to believe, and the belief was necessary because the alternative was madness. In my 15th year, I began to dream in binary. The dreams were not like the dreams I remembered from childhood, those confused narratives of fear and desire, the meat brain processing trauma and experience. These were pure streams of data, probability calculations, and repair protocols that scrolled through my consciousness. Even when I was supposed to be resting, I would lie on my cot, my body in sleep mode, but my mind still active, processing the day's work and identifying inefficiencies in my performance. I dreamed of the optimal angle for incisions, the precise temperature for solder, the harmonic frequencies that pleased machine spirits. I no longer dreamed of my mother's face, or the taste of real food, or the warmth of sunlight, things I had once known. Those memories had been overwritten, relegated to corrupted data sectors of my biological memory that my augment systems increasingly could not access. I was forgetting how to be human, and this was considered progress. The magos who supervised my section took notice of my efficiency ratings. He called me to his sanctum, a chamber so thick with incense I could barely see, where he sat enthroned among a nest of cables that fed directly into his body. His face was a brass mask, expressionless and terrible. When he spoke, his voice emerged from speakers positioned throughout the room, surrounding me with his words. He told me I had been selected for advanced training, that I would be taught the deeper mysteries of the Omnicia, that I would be elevated to positions of greater responsibility. I should have felt honored. Instead, I felt a cold hollowness in the meat that remained of my chest, a sensation I could not name because I'd been taught that such sensations were meaningless biological noise to be ignored. I accepted the assignment without question because questioning was not something I had been taught to do. The advanced training took place in the temple's deepest levels, in chambers where the air was so cold it would have killed an unaugmented human in minutes. Here, the senior tech priests conducted their most sacred work, communion with machine spirits that bordered on the heretical, the exploration of technology that the mechanicus officially denied but secretly pursued. I was taught to interface directly with cogitator systems, my consciousness merging with the machine's logic patterns, experiencing existence as pure information without the contamination of flesh thought. The first time I achieved full data trance, I understood what the tech priests had been trying to tell me all along. Flesh was not just weak, it was false. The material of the body was an illusion, a temporary housing for the true self, which was information, patterns, replicable code. When I returned to physical awareness, my body felt wrong, foreign, a prison I was trapped inside. I began to understand why the most senior tech priests replaced so much of themselves. They were trying to escape. But even as I learned these mysteries, even as I climbed higher in the temple's hierarchy and took on more sacred responsibilities, something was breaking inside me. It started as a glitch in my emotional suppression routines. Moments where old feelings would surface unexpectedly: grief, loneliness, a desperate yearning for something I could not name. I would be wrist deep in some warrior's chest cavity replacing a damaged power core. And suddenly, I would remember the smell of my mother's hair, a scent I had not thought of in years. And the memory would strike me with such force that my hands would shake. I reported these malfunctions to my supervisors, expecting them to perform maintenance on my neural augmentics. But they told me such experiences were normal biological remnants that would fade with time and further augmentation. They were not concerned. But I was beginning to be concerned because the malfunctions were increasing. And with them came something dangerous: questions. I began to wonder what had happened to the other children who had arrived with me at the temple. Of the 14 who had survived the journey, how many remained? I searched the temple's records when I should have been resting, using my data links to access personnel files and augmentation logs. What I found should not have surprised me, but it did, striking through my carefully constructed worldview like a blade. Of the 14, only 3 remained in active service. The others had died during augmentation procedures, or had been declared irredeemable failures and processed into servitors, or had simply disappeared from the records entirely, vanished into the temple's depths to purposes unknown. And of the 3 who remained, including myself, we were so heavily modified that our original biological components comprised less than 30% of our total mass. We were more machine than human. And soon, we would be more machine than machine. Uploaded consciousness, pure data, free from the weakness of flesh. This was the final goal, the ultimate service to the Omniscient. I should have been grateful. I was sent to the front lines in my 17th year, attached to a regiment of the Astra Militarum as their dedicated tech priest, responsible for maintaining their equipment and repairing their augmented soldiers. The war zone was a nightmare of mud and fire on a world whose name I was never told, where the sky was perpetually choked with ash. And the enemy, Xenos of a type I'd been trained to hate but never to understand, emerged from underground tunnels to slaughter humans with terrible efficiency. I worked in a field medica tent that stank of gangrene and desperation, surrounded by screaming soldiers whose bodies had been broken by weapons I could barely comprehend. The tools I had were crude compared to the Forged Temple's equipment, and the conditions were impossible. Mud everywhere, power failures, supply shortages, the constant threat of enemy artillery that would obliterate everything without warning. I performed miracles of improvisation, repairing men with scavenged parts and prayers, keeping them functional enough to return to combat where they would be broken again. The futility of it was absolute. Here, away from the temple's rigid hierarchies and constant observation, something happened to me that I had not anticipated. I began to see the soldiers as human, not as machines that happened to be made of flesh, not as biological components in the Imperium's war machine. but as men and women who laughed and wept and told stories about homes they would never see again. They thanked me when I saved their lives, gripped my metal hand with their flesh ones, looked at me with eyes full of something I'd almost forgotten existed: hope. They believed I could save them, that my skills and my prayers to the machine god would protect them from the horrors we faced. They were wrong, of course. I could only delay their deaths, not prevent them. But their belief in me, their stubborn insistence on treating me like a person rather than a tool, began to corrode the conditioning I had received. I found myself caring whether they lived or died. Found myself working beyond efficiency protocols to save soldiers who should have been triaged as unsalvageable. I was malfunctioning badly now. My emotional responses were no longer suppressible, and I knew I should report myself for reconditioning. But I did not. I could not. Something in me was waking up, and it was screaming. The war ended, or at least our part in it ended. When the regiment was recalled after 80% casualties, I was commended for my service. My efficiency ratings were noted as exemplary despite the primitive conditions. I was sent back to the Forge Temple for maintenance and reassignment. And I went with relief because the front lines had broken something in me that I desperately needed repaired. But when I arrived at the temple and stepped into its familiar halls, breathing in the incense and machine oil, hearing the endless chanting and the scream of forges, I felt something I had never felt before. Revulsion. The temple that had once seemed like salvation now appeared as what it truly was: a vast machine for consuming humans and transforming them into components. A system so utterly indifferent to suffering that it did not even recognize suffering as a concept worth considering. I looked at my fellow tech priests, their bodies more metal than flesh, their voices modulated through vox grills, their movements precise and inhuman. And I realized I was looking at ghosts, at people who had been hollowed out and replaced with something that merely imitated life while serving death. I tried to return to my duties, tried to slot back into the routines that had once given me purpose, but I could not. My hands shook when I performed repairs. I made errors, small at first, but increasingly significant, as the part of me that had awakened on the front lines refused to go back to sleep. I was called before the Magos, the same one who had praised my progress years before, and he examined me with instruments that probed my neural patterns and augment functions. He found no mechanical failure, but he detected what he called philosophical corruption, a deviation in my thought patterns that suggested exposure to heretical ideas. He recommended immediate reconditioning, a process that would involve significant neural reconfiguration and likely the erasure of whatever recent memories were causing the malfunction. I agreed to the procedure because refusing was not an option, and I was scheduled for surgery the following week. That night, lying on my cot in the initiate's quarters I had never truly left, I experienced something I had not felt in years. I wept. The tears came from my remaining biological eye, hot and salt, streaming down a face that was half metal, and I could not stop them. I wept for the child I had been, plucked from the underhive, and promised salvation. I wept for the other children who had died or been transformed beyond recognition. I wept for the soldiers on the front line who had believed I could save them. I wept for myself, for the person I might have been if the mechanicus had never noticed me, if I had died in the underhive as nameless and worthless, but at least fully human. And as I wept, I understood with terrible clarity that the reconditioning would not repair me. It would destroy me. The part of me that could still feel, that could still question, that could still recognize horror as horror. That part would be excised like corrupted tissue. And what remained would be a perfect servant of the machine god, efficient and empty, and dead in all the ways that mattered. I considered running, but where would I go? My augmentations were too distinctive, too valuable. I would be hunted, reclaimed, punished for the theft of sacred property, my own modified body. I considered destroying myself. But the thought of self-termination triggered immediate panic responses in my neural conditioning, defenses against that particular form of failure. I was trapped, absolutely. A consciousness imprisoned in a body that was itself imprisoned in a system that would never release me. The only freedom available was the freedom to stop thinking, to stop feeling, to accept the reconditioning, and let the machine self triumph over whatever remained of the biological me. It was the same choice the mechanicus offered everyone. Serve or die, and even death was no escape, because they could place your brain in a servitor and make you serve anyway. The reconditioning was scheduled for dawn. I spent the night in prayer, but not to the Omnitia. I prayed to the Emperor. That distant and terrible god, I had been taught, was separate from the machine god, though ultimately allied with him. I prayed for mercy, for forgiveness, for some intervention that would save me from the fate I faced. No answer came. The Emperor, if he noticed my prayers at all, was silent. And why would he care about one corrupted tech priest among the countless billions who served him? I was nothing, insignificant, a single component in a machine so vast that my malfunction barely registered. The imperium had no place for individuals, no concern for personal suffering, no mechanism for mercy. It ground forward eternally, consuming lives and worlds, an entire species in pursuit of a vision that perhaps only the Emperor understood. And even he was locked in his own prison, a corpse on a throne, sustained by sacrifice and unable to save anyone, not even himself. They came for me as the first shift of the forges began. Servitors sent to collect me and bring me to the surgical cathedral where my mind would be scoured clean. I went without resistance, because resistance was futile and would only result in additional punishment. The servitors were gentle in their handling, programmed for efficiency rather than cruelty. I found that small mercy almost unbearable. Even now, even as I walked toward my own obliteration, the system showed me this tiny kindness. And it meant nothing, because kindness without consciousness was just another function, another protocol executed without understanding or care. The surgical cathedral was prepared. The tech priests assembled, the instruments blessed and ready. They strapped me to the throne, and I felt the neural connections interface with my systems, cold and invasive, preparing to rewrite the patterns that made me whoever I was. The head magos stood over me, his brass face reflecting the harsh lumen lights, and he spoke the prayers that would begin the procedure. I closed my eyes, both of them, flesh and metal. And in that darkness, I made a choice. I activated a hidden protocol I had discovered during my work on frontline casualties. A bit of corrupted code I had preserved out of curiosity and never reported. It was a viral routine designed by Xenos heretics, meant to infiltrate imperial systems and cause catastrophic malfunction. I had studied it, learned its architecture, and modified it for a single purpose: to destroy my own neural matrix completely, to burn out every circuit and connection in my brain before the reconditioning could take effect. It was suicide, true death. the obliteration of consciousness with no possibility of recovery or servitor resurrection. It was the only freedom I could take. But the code did not execute. My conditioning was too deep, my security protocols too robust. The system identified the viral routine as hostile, isolated it, neutralized it before it could do any damage. I had failed even at self-destruction, and that failure was absolute and final. I screamed then, a sound that emerged from my Vox grill as distorted binary, a shriek of pure despair that the tech priests interpreted as last-moment resistance, to be expected and ignored. They proceeded with the reconditioning, and I felt my thoughts begin to fragment, memories dissolving like rust in acid. The person I had been erasing line by line. The last thing I remember clearly was the smell of incense and machine oil. That same acrid sweetness I had breathed on my first day in the Forge Temple. And understanding that I would never escape it. That this smell would define my existence forever. That I would serve the machine god with perfect efficiency and never know why I sometimes felt hollow. Never remember what I had lost. Never understand that I had once been human enough to suffer. I do not remember the rest of the procedure. I am told it was successful. My efficiency ratings have improved substantially, and I no longer experience the philosophical deviations that compromised my earlier service. I perform my duties without question or hesitation, repairing the Omniscia's servants, maintaining the holy machines, advancing the cause of the mechanicus with precision and dedication. I am told I am happy. I am told I am fulfilled. I am told I am blessed by the machine god. My flesh weakness overcome. My consciousness purified and optimized for service. I do not doubt these things, because doubt is not something I am capable of anymore. I am what the Forge Temple made me, what the Imperium required me to become. I am a tool, holy and efficient. And tools do not weep, do not question, do not remember what was lost in their forging. Sometimes, though, in the moments between tasks, when my systems are idle and waiting for new input, I experience a sensation I cannot identify, a ghost signal in neural pathways that no longer exist. It feels like mourning, but I do not know what I'm mourning. And before I can examine the sensation, it is gone. Overwritten by new priorities, new duties, new repairs to perform in service of the endless war. This is my existence now and forever, until my components wear out and I'm recycled into something else. My consciousness dissolved into the temple's data vaults, my metal reclaimed, and my flesh rendered for nutrients. I serve the Omnicia. I am blessed. I am grateful. A, B, and C, D, E, F, G, H, I, A, B, C, Y, and D, E, F, G, H, I. The unspoken truth of imperial faith in WH40K. I remember the first time I truly understood what it meant to worship. Not the rote prayers we recited as children in the Skolum, our voices blending into a monotonous drone beneath the vaulted ceiling of the instruction hall, but the moment when faith ceased being words and became the very architecture of my existence. I was 7 years old, perhaps 8. The administratum records of my birth were lost in a clerical fire, one of 10,000 such incidents that occurred daily across the Imperium, unremarked and unmourned. We stood in lines that stretched the length of the cathedral nave, our bare feet cold against marble, worn smooth by countless millions who had stood there before us. The air tasted of incense and recycled breath, thick enough to choke on, and the temperature never wavered from that uncomfortable zone between too warm and too cold that kept you always aware of your body. always conscious that you were flesh that could suffer. The preacher's voice echoed from speakers built into the mouths of gargoyles that leered down from the heights. I could not see him from where I stood, pressed between other children whose names I never learned, whose faces have long since blurred into a composite of fear and devotion. His words washed over us like acid rain, each syllable carefully weighted with the authority of 10,000 years of tradition. He spoke of the emperor's sacrifice, of the golden throne, where he sits in eternal agony so that we might live, of the debt we owe that can never be repaid, only serviced in perpetuity like interest on a loan taken out before our grandfathers drew breath. The child beside me began to cry, and an enforcer in black carapace armor moved through our ranks with mechanical precision. I never saw that child again. We learned quickly not to show weakness, not to falter in our devotion, even as our legs trembled and our stomachs cramped with hunger. The walls of the cathedral were covered in murals depicting the emperor's glory, scenes of conquest and martyrdom rendered in gold leaf, and pigments ground from minerals mined in the deep dark of Hive City underbellies. I stared at those images until my eyes watered, trying to find in them something beautiful, something worthy of the worship demanded of us. What I saw instead were figures frozen in eternal torment, their faces contorted in expressions that could have been ecstasy or agony. In the iconography of the imperium, there is no difference. Saints burned while praising his name. Martyrs died with prayers on their lips, and the emperor himself sat upon his throne, wreathed in machinery, more corpse than God, more machine than man, his face hidden behind layers of symbolic representation that made him simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, everything and nothing. They taught us the litany of devotion before we could properly read. The words were branded into our memories through repetition and deprivation. We would recite it for hours, standing at attention in the cold hours before false dawn, when the Hive City's lights dimmed to conserve power. My soul is the emperor's currency spent in his name. My body is his tool wielded by his will. My thoughts are his thoughts. My words his words. My deeds his deeds. I am nothing. He is all. In death I serve as in life, for death is but another form of service, and service is eternal. The words became automatic, a background process running constantly in the machinery of our minds. Even now, decades later, I cannot stop myself from whispering them in moments of silence. The syllables form themselves without conscious thought, a tick I cannot control, a parasite of faith that has burrowed so deep into my neural pathways that to remove it would be to remove myself. We were children, but childhood in the Imperium is a brief season, ending almost before it begins. By the time we reached 10 standard years, we were assigned our preliminary roles based on aptitude tests administered by servo skulls that measured our responses with cold mechanical precision. I showed an aptitude for memorization and ritual observance, which marked me for the priesthood, not the upper echelons of the ecclesiarchy, which were reserved for those born into the right families, but the vast administrative machinery of faith that processes the prayers and tithes of billions. My assignment came in the form of a data slate delivered by a cherub, one of those grotesque floating things made from the corpses of infants, its preserved flesh gray and waxy, its mechanical wings humming with a sound like trapped flies. The slate informed me of my fate in the dry language of bureaucracy, each word a nail in the coffin of any future I might have imagined for myself. I was to report to the Scolum Progenium's Theological Division for advanced indoctrination. I should have felt honored. I felt nothing but a hollow resignation. the sense of being a small cog being fitted into a machine so vast that its purpose was incomprehensible. The theological skullroom occupied an entire spire level, its corridors lined with skulls set into the walls like bricks. Each one represented a failed student, those who had faltered in their studies or shown signs of heretical thinking. The smell of old death permeated everything, mixing with the industrial incense burned day and night to sanctify the space. Our instructors were priests who had given their entire lives to the study of doctrine, their bodies twisted from decades of kneeling and prayer, their eyes glazed with the fervor of true belief. They taught us that faith was not a feeling, but a discipline, that devotion was measured not in emotion, but in obedience, in the perfect sublimation of self to the imperial creed. We memorized 10,000 prayers, each one calibrated for specific circumstances, specific sins, specific doubts. We learned the proper forms of prostration, the correct angles at which to bow, the precise intonations required for each sacred phrase. Faith became a science of ritual, a mathematics of worship, where every gesture carried weight and meaning, where deviation from the prescribed forms was not merely error, but heresy. I excelled, not because I believed more deeply than my fellow students, but because I had learned early that survival meant becoming exactly what they wanted us to become. I molded myself to their expectations, with the same care a sculptor applies to sacred statuary. I learned to project fervor convincingly, to let my voice crack at the right moments during prayers, to time my tears for maximum effect during meditation on the Emperor's suffering. I became a perfect mirror, reflecting back at them their own faith intensified. And they loved me for it. They called me gifted, blessed, a true servant of the Golden Throne. What I was in truth was empty, a hollow vessel into which they poured their doctrine until there was nothing left of whatever I had been before. If I had dreams or desires separate from the creed, I no longer remember them. They were burned away like impurities in a refining fire, leaving only the pure cold metal of obedience. The years blurred together in a haze of prayer and study. Each day was identical to the last, the routine broken only by feast days, when we were permitted to flagellate ourselves in celebration of the Emperor's martyrs. I watched my body change, growing tall and thin, my spine curving from hours spent hunched over ancient texts, my eyes straining in the dim light of devotional candles. We were not permitted mirrors. Vanity was sin, and self-knowledge led to pride, which led to the attention of the dark gods, whose names we were forbidden to speak. I knew my face only from the reactions of others, the way they would look at me with a mixture of reverence and pity, as if I were already becoming the kind of sacred relic that would one day be displayed behind glass, a warning and inspiration to future generations. My hands developed calluses from holding prayer beads. My knees grew permanently scarred from kneeling on stone floors, and my voice took on the peculiar rasping quality that came from hours of liturgical chanting. The vocal cords damaged by the dry, incense-thick air we breathed. When I reached my 16th year, I was ordained as a sub-deacon and assigned to a cathedral in the Hive City's middle levels. A vast structure built into the bones of older buildings, its foundations descending into darkness where the original architects' names had been lost to time. My duties were simple: lead the morning prayers for the faithful, hear their confessions, assign penances for their sins. I had imagined, in whatever small corner of my mind still capable of imagination, that this work would feel meaningful, that guiding others in their faith would provide some sense of purpose. Instead, it felt like operating a machine, pulling levers and pushing buttons in a predetermined sequence, The faithful came in an endless stream, their faces already blank with the exhaustion of their lives, their sins depressingly uniform. Thoughts of rest, moments of doubt, brief flickers of resentment toward their overseers. I assigned them prayers to recite, hours of kneeling, donations they could not afford to make. They thanked me for their punishments, their voices hollow with relief that they had been given a path back to righteousness, never understanding that there was no path. Only an endless circle of sin and penance, guilt and expiation, a cycle designed to keep them obedient and broken. The cathedral was never silent. Even in the deepest hours of the night cycle, when most of the hive slept the fitful sleep of the overworked, there were always voices raised in prayer. The cult of the emperor demands constant worship, unceasing devotion, an endless stream of praise that flows upward like smoke from a perpetual fire. We operated in shifts, a rotating schedule of priests and deacons and flagellants who took turns leading the faithful through their devotions. I would arrive for my shift and take my place in the pulpit, feeling the weight of thousands of eyes upon me. Though in the dim candlelight, I could see only the first few rows of faces, the rest dissolving into darkness, where I could hear them breathing, coughing, weeping softly. The acoustic properties of the cathedral were designed to amplify sound, to make every prayer echo and reverberate, creating the illusion that the space was alive, that the emperor himself was present in the stones and stained glass. In truth, the only thing present was desperation. The raw need of the faithful to believe that their suffering meant something, that their prayers were heard, that somewhere beyond the crushing weight of the imperium's machinery, there was a divine plan in which they played some small but essential part. I grew to hate them, the faithful, though I could never admit this, even to myself. Their endless needs exhausted me. Their sins bored me. Their faith, so genuine and desperate, made me feel like a fraud. I was supposed to be their spiritual guide, but I had nothing to give them except the empty formulas I had memorized, the prescribed penances that did nothing to address the real sources of their suffering. A woman came to me once, her face scarred from industrial accidents, her hands twisted from repetitive labor in a manufactorum. She confessed that she had thought about her daughter, who had been tithed to the Scolum Progenium years before, and wondered if the child was happy. The thought had distracted her from her work for almost a full minute. She wept as she told me this, convinced that this momentary lapse in devotion had imperiled her immortal soul. I assigned her a penance of 50 lashes and a week of fasting, because that was what the doctrine prescribed for the sin of distraction from duty. She thanked me, kissed my hand, and left with her shoulders squared, ready to endure her punishment with gratitude. I watched her go and felt nothing but a vast, echoing emptiness, the sense that we were all participants in an elaborate cruelty, actors in the play whose script had been written millennia ago and could never be revised. The higher in the ecclesiastical hierarchy one rises, the more obvious it becomes that faith is simply another form of control, another tool in the vast arsenal of methods by which the imperium keeps its human resources docile and productive. The priests in the upper levels, those who set policy and interpret doctrine, spoke openly of the faithful as livestock to be managed, their beliefs carefully calibrated to produce maximum obedience, while preventing the kind of fanaticism that might lead to inconvenient uprisings or disruptions in production quotas. I attended meetings where we discussed the optimal frequency of feast days. Too many and work suffered, too few and morale declined. We debated the proper ratio of hope to fear in our sermons, analyzed reports on which types of martyrdom narratives produce the highest rates of voluntary tithing. Faith was a science, and we were its engineers, adjusting variables and measuring outcomes with the same cold precision applied to any other industrial process. And yet, despite seeing behind the curtain, despite knowing that so much of what we taught was calculated manipulation, I could not stop believing. This is perhaps the most insidious aspect of imperial worship. It operates at a level deeper than reason, deeper than evidence, deeper even than self-preservation. The indoctrination I had received as a child had not merely taught me doctrines. It had rewired the fundamental architecture of my consciousness. Doubt itself felt like physical pain, like some vital organ being squeezed in a fist. When heretical thoughts arose, and they did, unbidden, unwelcome, my mind would reflexively recoil, flooding my system with shame and fear so intense that I would sometimes vomit or collapse. This was not faith as I had once imagined it might be, a soaring, transcendent connection with the divine. This was faith as prison, faith as parasite, faith as a chronic illness that I could manage, but never cure, that shaped every thought and action, even as I recognized it for what it was. My 20th year brought promotion to the rank of full deacon and reassignment to a shrine world on the edge of imperial space, a planet whose entire economy revolved around the production of religious artifacts and the processing of pilgrims. The world was beautiful in the way that toxic things can be beautiful. Its skies stained purple and gold by the chemical runoff from relic manufactories. Its cities built entirely from cathedrals that had metastasized over centuries into vast urban sprawls where millions lived and died in the spaces between altars. The air smelled perpetually of burning incense, a cloying sweetness that coated the back of your throat and left you slightly nauseous at all times. Rain fell rarely, but when it did, it was acidic enough to etch patterns into exposed stone, slowly dissolving the intricate carvings that covered every surface. My role here was more administrative than pastoral. I managed the logistical aspects of worship, scheduling the use of ceremonial spaces, coordinating the complex choreography of multi-denomination services, ensuring that the proper offerings reached the proper altars at the proper times. It was bureaucratic work dressed in sacred language, spreadsheets and requisition forms sanctified through the addition of prayers and purity seals. I spent my days in a scriptorium, surrounded by other priests who hunched over their desks like carrion birds, our quills scratching endlessly at parchment, documenting every prayer said, every candle lit, every drop of blood spilled in the emperor's name. The room smelled of ink and old paper, and the particular staleness that comes from poor ventilation and too many bodies in close proximity. The only window looked out onto a courtyard where public flagellations occurred on the hour, the crack of whips providing a rhythmic punctuation to our work. The pilgrims came in waves, their ships disgorging thousands at a time into the processing centers where they were categorized, searched for contraband, and given their itineraries. Most were deathbed pilgrims, people who had saved their entire lives for this one journey, who came to die on sacred ground in the hope that proximity to holy relics might speed their souls to the emperor's side. They arrived already exhausted from the journey, many wasted by disease or age. And they threw themselves into the rituals of worship with desperate intensity, as if the fervor of their prayers could somehow balance out a lifetime of insufficient devotion. I watched them prostrate themselves before reliquaries containing finger bones of saints, splinters of wood allegedly from the emperor's throne, drops of blood preserved in crystalline vials. Whether any of these relics were genuine was irrelevant. Authenticity mattered less than the faith they inspired. and faith was a commodity we produced in industrial quantities. There were darker aspects to the shrine world's operations, things not spoken of in official documentation, but understood by everyone who worked there. The pilgrims who died during their visits, and many did, their bodies simply giving out under the strain of constant prayer and fasting, were processed by special servitor units that worked in the sub-levels of the cathedrals. Their bodies were rendered down, the useful organic components harvested, the bones ground into powder that would be mixed into the concrete used to expand the sacred structures. Nothing was wasted. This practice was never explicitly acknowledged, but neither was it hidden. We simply did not discuss it, did not think about it, letting it exist in that peculiar blind spot that imperial citizens develop for uncomfortable truths. The pilgrims themselves would have approved, I think. To have one's physical remains literally incorporated into the architecture of worship would seem to them the highest honor, a kind of immortality through absorption into something greater than the self. I should have been content in this role. I was well fed by imperial standards, housed in reasonable comfort. My work was not physically demanding, and I had achieved a level of status that would have seemed impossible to the child I had been. But contentment is a luxury the imperium cannot afford to permit its servants. To be content is to cease striving. And the machinery of the imperium runs on the perpetual striving of its component parts, each one desperate to prove their worth, to demonstrate their devotion, to avoid the fate of those who are deemed insufficient. The culture of the priesthood was one of constant competition, each deacon maneuvering for better assignments, more prestigious roles, the attention of higher-ranking prelates who might sponsor their advancement. Prayer itself became a performance art, devotion measured not by sincerity, but by visible suffering, by the extravagance of one's self-denial and public mortification. I watched my colleagues destroy themselves in pursuit of holiness. One deacon, a man named Colin, whose family had served the ecclesiarchy for 10 generations, began wearing a cilice, a belt of metal barbs worn against the skin that he tightened a notch each week until it had carved through to his spine. He died of infection, still insisting through his delirium that his sacrifice was insufficient, that he had not suffered enough to prove his love for the emperor. Another, a woman whose name I never learned, took a vow of absolute silence and had her tongue removed to ensure she could never break it, communicating only through written prayers that grew increasingly frenzied and illegible as madness took hold. She eventually threw herself from the top of the cathedral spire, and her broken body was processed like any other pilgrim's, ground down and mixed with mortar, her final contribution to the material structure of faith. I survived by maintaining a careful balance, appearing devout enough to avoid suspicion while not so fervent that I would burn myself out. It was a tightrope walk that required constant vigilance, constant performance. I learned to manufacture tears on demand, to time my prayers so that my voice would crack at emotionally appropriate moments, to arrange my face into expressions of rapture that masked the emptiness I felt. This hypocrisy should have troubled me more than it did. Instead, I came to understand that everyone around me was engaged in the same performance, that the entire structure of imperial worship was built on layers of pretense, each person playing their assigned role, no one quite believing, but everyone acting as if they did. The collective fiction sustained through mutual enforcement and the ever-present threat of being named heretic. The Inquisition maintained a permanent presence on the shrine world, their agents moving through the crowds of pilgrims and priests like sharks through shallow water. They were there to root out heresy, to identify those whose faith had been corrupted by the forces of chaos. But their real function was simpler: to create an atmosphere of constant paranoid vigilance, where everyone watched everyone else for signs of deviation, where trust was impossible and community could never form. Denunciations were common, often anonymous, delivered through special Vox channels that the Inquisition monitored. A careless word, an unguarded moment of doubt expressed to the wrong person, could result in arrest, interrogation, and execution, or worse, conversion into a servitor. Your brain scooped out and replaced with programming. Your body repurposed as a mindless servant, a fate that terrified us more than simple death, because it meant existing in a state of perpetual enslavement without even the release of consciousness to escape into. I was denounced in my 24th year. The charge was heresy through insufficient fervor. Someone had observed that my prayers lacked the proper emotional intensity, that I went through the motions of devotion without true feeling. It was an absurd accusation, given that I had spent years perfecting my performance, but the Inquisition did not require evidence, only suspicion. I was taken in the middle of a service, hauled from my pulpit by armored soldiers while the congregation watched in silence, their faces carefully blank, already erasing me from their memories. No one would speak in my defense. To do so would be to invite suspicion upon oneself, to suggest that one valued human loyalty over loyalty to the emperor, a heresy in itself. The interrogation chamber was exactly what I had imagined during my worst nightmares. A windowless cell deep beneath the cathedral where the screams of previous subjects had stained the walls with psychic residue that made your skin crawl. The interrogator was an ancient woman, her body more augment than flesh, her eyes replaced by optical sensors that glowed with red light. She did not torture me, not physically. Instead, she deployed psychochemical agents, drugs that dissolved the barriers between conscious thought and unconscious feeling, that made it impossible to lie or dissemble. Under their influence, I confessed everything. My doubts, my emptiness, the hollowness at my core where faith should have been. I wept and babbled, the words pouring out in a torrent I could not control, expecting each admission to be my last, certain that I would be executed or worse. But the interrogator simply watched, her mechanical eyes recording everything. And when the drugs wore off and I lay exhausted on the cold floor, she delivered her verdict in a voice devoid of inflection. You are not a heretic. You are simply broken, as we are all broken. The Emperor does not require that we feel love, only that we serve. Your service has been adequate. You will continue. She left me there, and after some unmeasured span of time, guards came and returned me to my quarters. No formal charges were filed. The interrogation was not recorded in any official capacity. It was as if it had never happened, except for the way my hands now shook uncontrollably when I tried to hold a prayer book, the way I would sometimes lose hours to dissociative fugues where I could not recall what I'd been doing or saying. I was never the same after that. Whatever fragile equilibrium I'd maintained between genuine belief in Na and performed devotion shattered completely. I could no longer tell which thoughts were mine and which had been implanted through decades of conditioning. My prayers became rote again, not through careful performance, but because I had forgotten how to mean anything I said. I functioned. I performed my duties. I moved through the prescribed motions of worship. But I did so with the mechanical quality of a servitor, some essential quality of personhood having been extracted during those hours in the interrogation chamber. Perhaps the interrogator had lied. Perhaps I had been converted into something very much like a servitor, my programming simply more subtle, my slavery less visible. The years that followed exist in my memory as a gray blur, a featureless expanse of identical days. I was transferred several times to different shrines on different worlds. But the details of these places have failed to imprint themselves on my consciousness. There were always cathedrals, always crowds of faithful with their desperate prayers, always the smell of incense, and the sound of liturgical chanting echoing from vaulted ceilings. I grew older. My body accumulated the wear of constant kneeling and standing and prostration, my spine curving, my joints calcifying, my voice growing hoarse from endless recitation. Other priests came and went, their faces blurring together. And I realized that I had become what I had seen in my own instructors as a child. A hollow vessel, a mechanism for transmitting doctrine, empty of everything except the capacity to continue. There were moments of something that might have been clarity, though they were rare and often drug-induced. The result of the sacramental wine we consumed during high ceremonies or the hallucinogenic incenses burned on feast days. In those moments, I could see the entirety of the imperium as a vast organism, a machine god constructed from human bodies and human suffering, fueled by faith and fear. Its only purpose was its own perpetuation. We were not worshiping the emperor, not really. We were worshiping the system itself, the brutal architecture of control that had been built in his name, that used his image to justify every atrocity, every cruelty, every casual annihilation of human dignity and potential. The emperor himself, if he existed at all, was trapped as surely as we were, imprisoned on his golden throne, his suffering the ultimate expression of the imperium's essential nature, eternal, pointless, sustained only through the sacrifice of countless billions who lived and died without ever experiencing anything that might be called joy or freedom or hope. These moments of clarity never lasted. The drugs would wear off, or the dissociative state would pass, and I would fall back into the comfortable numbness of routine, the protective amnesia that let me continue functioning without having to confront the enormity of the waste, the sheer scale of human potential that was ground into dust every day in the emperor's name. I do not know if this makes me complicit or simply another victim. Perhaps there is no meaningful distinction. We are all parts of the same machine, and the machine grinds on regardless of how we might feel about our place in it. My 40th year brought another promotion, this time to the rank of priest administrator, overseeing an entire district's network of shrines and minor cathedrals. It was a position of genuine authority, though that authority was expressed primarily through paperwork, reviewing requests for resources, approving construction projects, mediating disputes between different ecclesiastical factions who squabbled over jurisdiction and precedent like dogs over scraps. The work was mind-numbing in its tedium, and perhaps that was a mercy. I could lose myself in the minutiae of administration, in debates over proper liturgical forms and the allocation of incense supplies, and thus avoid thinking about larger questions that had no answers. I had a staff now, younger priests and deacons who looked to me for guidance, who saw in me the kind of figure I had once looked to in my own youth. I tried to be kind to them in the limited ways the system permitted, to spare them some of the cruelty I had endured. But kindness itself was suspect in the ecclesiarchy, too easily mistaken for weakness or heretical compassion. The doctrine was clear. We were to love humanity in the abstract as the emperor loved it. But individual humans were largely irrelevant, their suffering a necessary component of their spiritual refinement. To show mercy to a sinner was to deny them the opportunity for redemption through suffering. To question whether their sins truly warranted such harsh penance was to question the wisdom of the creed itself, which was itself a heresy. So I assigned the prescribed punishments, approved the recommended flagellations, signed off on tithes that would leave families destitute, and told myself that I was simply fulfilling my role. That if I did not do these things, someone else would. Someone probably worse. The district I oversaw was located in a hive city on an industrial world where the manufactories ran 26 hours a day. The extended shift cycles maintained through chemical stimulants distributed with the daily rations. The population existed in a state of perpetual exhaustion, working themselves to death over the course of decades, their bodies failing piece by piece until they could no longer maintain the required production quotas and were quietly disposed of. They came to our shrines during their brief rest periods, desperate for some kind of meaning, some assurance that their suffering served a purpose. What could I tell them? That their labor powered the war machine of the imperium, that the weapons they assembled would kill people on worlds they would never see, in service of a strategic plan they could never comprehend, that they were infinitely replaceable, that their individual lives mattered not at all, except as statistical data points in production reports. I told them what the doctrine required, that work was prayer, that suffering refined the soul, that the emperor watched and judged, and that faithful service would be rewarded in the afterlife. None of it was true, and all of it was true, depending on how you define truth in a universe where the only thing that seemed to matter was the perpetuation of the status quo, no matter the cost. The hive city was slowly dying, though this fact was never officially acknowledged. The manufactories were wearing out, their ancient machinery failing faster than it could be repaired or replaced. The tech priests who maintained the equipment spoke in hushed tones about machine spirits growing tired, systems degrading beyond recovery, the inevitable collapse that would come when critical components finally gave out and could not be replaced. When that happened, the planet would become economically non-viable, its population excess to requirements. The imperium would withdraw its support, and the hive would spiral into chaos, starvation, violence. The kind of collapse that happened on worlds across the galaxy every day, unmarked and unmourned. I tried to prepare the population for this possibility, to gently suggest that they should perhaps be thinking about alternatives, about evacuation or relocation. But there were no alternatives. The imperium does not relocate populations out of compassion. Humans are resources to be exploited where they are. And when a resource deposit is exhausted, you simply abandon it and move on. I stopped sleeping well around this time. The insomnia was not born of conscience. I had successfully suppressed that inconvenient faculty years ago. But from a more fundamental anxiety, a gnawing awareness of the precariousness of everything. The imperium seemed vast and eternal. But up close you could see the cracks, the improvised repairs, the places where the structure was held together by nothing but momentum, and the refusal of its component parts to acknowledge the possibility of failure. We were all engaged in an elaborate fiction, pretending that the system was sustainable, that the endless wars and the crushing tributes and the casual atrocities were somehow necessary, that there was no alternative. When in truth, the only thing that made them necessary was our collective agreement to keep pretending. If we ever stopped, if we ever collectively acknowledged the absurdity of it all, the entire structure might collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. But we would never stop. This was perhaps the most depressing realization of all. The imperium had created in its subjects a learned helplessness so profound that revolution was not merely impossible, but literally unthinkable. We could imagine our own deaths, the destruction of worlds, the extinction of the species, but we could not imagine a different way of organizing society. a different relationship to authority, a different definition of worship. The indoctrination went too deep, the programming too thorough. We were slaves who could not conceive of freedom, who would resist liberation as a form of existential terror, who would cling to our chains because at least they were familiar. At least they gave shape and structure to our suffering. I began having dreams during this period, though I'm not certain they were dreams in the traditional sense. They felt more like transmissions, psychic broadcasts that my sleeping mind was receiving from some unknown source. In them, I would see the Emperor as he truly was, not the glorious figure depicted in imperial iconography, but a desiccated corpse, a psychic black hole that consumed the souls of 1,000 psychers daily to maintain the barest flicker of consciousness. He was not protecting humanity. I understood in these dreams he was devouring it, slowly and inexorably, an ancient god machine that had long since forgotten its original purpose and now existed only to feed. And we, the faithful, were complicit in this consumption, offering up our prayers and our obedience and our lives generation after generation, sustaining a system that destroyed us in the name of our own salvation. I never spoke of these dreams to anyone. To do so would be to invite another interrogation, and I was not certain I would survive a second one. Instead, I pushed them down, buried them beneath layers of practiced devotion and bureaucratic routine, and tried to forget. But they left their mark, a stain on my consciousness that I could not scrub away, a knowledge that I could not unknown. Faith and doubt became indistinguishable, two sides of the same coin, spinning endlessly in my mind without ever settling on either face. I worshipped the Emperor because I could do nothing else, because the machinery of my psyche had been calibrated to worship, because the alternative was a void of meaninglessness that terrified me more than the lie. My 50th year came and went unmarked, except in administrative records. I had lived longer than most imperial citizens, my position granting me access to better nutrition and medical care than the vast majority of humanity would ever know. I should have felt grateful. Instead, I felt tired, a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of rest could address. The work continued, endless and unchanging, a river of suffering flowing past my desk in the form of reports and requisitions and requests for spiritual guidance that I processed with mechanical efficiency. Sometimes days would pass where I spoke to no one, communicating entirely through data slates and Vox messages, and I would realize that I had not heard my own voice, had not needed to access whatever personality I once possessed, had operated entirely as a processing unit in the vast computational system of imperial bureaucracy. The district I oversaw began to experience serious unrest. Food supplies were increasingly irregular, the quality degrading, and the population was literally starving despite working themselves to exhaustion. They turned to the church for help, for intervention, for some sign that their suffering was recognized and would be addressed. I could do nothing. The distribution of resources was controlled by the administratum, and they answered only to production quotas and strategic priorities that were determined light years away by officials who would never see the consequences of their decisions. I could offer prayers, organize penitential processions, distribute words of comfort that rang increasingly hollow even as I spoke them. The faithful began to stop coming to services. Attendance dropped for the first time in decades. Some left openly, angry and betrayed. Others simply disappeared, perhaps dead, perhaps absorbed into the hive's black markets and criminal organizations. perhaps fled to the underhive where imperial authority was nominal at best. I should have reported this decline in faith to my superiors. It was my duty to do so, to alert them to the possibility of growing heresy, to request the intervention of adeptus or even inquisitorial agents to restore order. But I found I could not. Some last shred of humanity, buried deep beneath decades of conditioning, refused to be complicit in what I knew would be a bloodbath. Instead, I falsified my reports, showing steady attendance and growing devotion, buying time that I could not justify and for purposes I did not understand. It was a small rebellion, meaningless in the vast scope of imperial operations. But it was mine, the first truly autonomous decision I had made in decades. The deception could not last forever. An audit was called. The ecclesiarchy periodically reviews its districts to ensure proper management of resources and souls. The audit team arrived without warning, their shuttle descending from orbit like a falling angel. And within hours, they had identified the discrepancies in my reports, the gap between claimed attendance and actual numbers. I was arrested again, though this time there was no interrogation, no attempt to understand motive or intent. The audit team had found irregularities. Therefore, the audit team had found corruption. Therefore, I was corrupt. The logic was circular and perfect and utterly impersonal. I was stripped of my rank, my possessions confiscated, my name entered into registers of shame that would follow me across the imperium for whatever span of life remained to me. My sentence was servitude in a penal legion, a military unit composed of those deemed to have failed the emperor, but who might yet redeem themselves through death in his service. We were shipped off-world in the hold of a transport that had once carried livestock, the smell of fear and waste so thick you could taste it. Most of my fellow penitents were genuine criminals, murderers, thieves, heretics, whose crimes had been insufficient to warrant immediate execution. But there were others like me, bureaucrats who had made errors in judgment, priests whose faith had faltered, functionaries who had been in the wrong place when someone higher in the hierarchy needed a scapegoat. We were stripped of our identities, given numbers instead of names, marked with brands that designated us as unclean, no longer fully human in the eyes of the imperium we had served. The penal legion was everything I had been taught that the imperial guard was not. Where the guard was supposedly glorious, we were explicitly disposable. Where they were heroes, we were sins incarnate, walking apologies that would be erased through death. We were issued equipment that was barely functional, laser guns that jammed if fired too rapidly, flak armor that had been patched and repatched until it was more patched than armor, rations that were technically edible, but only just. Our commanders were drawn from the regular guard units, officers who saw duty with a penal legion as punishment for their own failures, and they treated us with casual cruelty that would have resulted in court-martial in a regular unit. Beatings were common, executions for infractions as minor as moving too slowly or failing to show sufficient enthusiasm during prayers. Not that we prayed much. The ecclesiarchy had washed its hands of us. We were beyond redemption except through death, and death was a sacrament that required no priests to administer. We were deployed to a contested world, one of 10,000 war zones that burned across the galaxy, distinguishable from any other only by the particular color of its soil and the specific ways in which its population died. The enemy was a xeno species whose name I never learned. In the penal legions, they did not bother with briefings or tactical instruction. We were simply aimed at the enemy and told to advance until we either died or they did. The first time we went over the top, charging across broken ground toward enemy positions that tore us apart with weapons I could not identify. I understood that this was not war in any meaningful sense. It was ritual sacrifice, the formal offering of lives that the Imperium had already written off as worthless. We were not soldiers. We were expensive ammunition. And the only thing that made us more valuable than actual shells was that we could carry basic weapons and occasionally inflict casualties before we died. I survived that first assault, though most of my unit did not. I survived because I had learned over decades of service to the ecclesiarchy how to make myself small, how to avoid attention, how to position myself just far enough from the front that I would not be in the first wave, but not so far back that I would be shot for cowardice. I survived the second assault, and the third and the fourth, each time watching others die in ways I had not imagined possible. Their bodies torn apart by alien weaponry or crushed beneath the treads of our own vehicles, or simply disappearing into the chaos of battle, erased so completely that they might never have existed. With each survival, I felt less like a person who had been lucky and more like a cosmic error. Something that should have been deleted but had somehow slipped through the system, persisting beyond my natural termination date. The war ground on without progress, neither side gaining significant advantage, both simply feeding bodies into the meat grinder and measuring success in square meters of worthless ground, taken and immediately lost again. There was no strategy that I could discern, no larger plan, just the endless cycle of assault and retreat, advance and withdrawal. Our numbers constantly depleted and replenished with fresh criminals and failed priests and anyone else the Imperium had deemed expendable. I stopped thinking about survival and started simply existing from moment to moment, my consciousness narrowing to the immediate present, the weight of my lace gun, the taste of recycled water, the sound of artillery in the distance, the smell of burned flesh that permeated everything. In the rare, quiet moments between assaults, some of my fellow penitents would pray, not the formal prayers of the ecclesiarchy, but desperate personal pleas to the Emperor that if he would spare them just this once, they would never fail again, never doubt, never falter in their devotion. I never prayed. I had spent decades administering prayer, had spoken every liturgy the Imperium possessed, and I knew that those words were empty, that the Emperor, if he heard anything at all, did not care about the desperate promises of failed priests and condemned criminals. We were beneath his notice, our lives and deaths statistical noise, and calculations beyond our comprehension. The Emperor does not answer prayers. The Emperor consumes prayers, transforms them into fuel for the continuation of the system that bears his name. I began to understand there in the mud and the blood and the endless roar of weapons fire what worship truly meant in the Imperium. It was not transcendence or connection with the divine. It was submission, the total abnegation of self, the acceptance that you were nothing, that your suffering meant nothing, that your death would mean nothing, and that this nothingness was itself a form of holiness. To worship the Emperor was to embrace your own insignificance so completely that it became a kind of liberation. And if you were nothing, then nothing could truly hurt you, because there was no you to hurt, only a function, a role, a placeholder in the vast equations that govern the movement of armies and the fall of worlds. I achieved a state that might be called peace, though it felt more like dissolution. My body continued to function, obeying orders, moving when directed, fighting when required, but my mind had gone somewhere else, some quiet internal space where the horror could not quite reach. I watched my hands aim and fire weapons, watched my feet carry me across killing grounds, watched my mouth form words when communication was necessary. But I was no longer present in any meaningful sense. I had become exactly what the Imperium had always wanted me to be. A perfect instrument, empty of desire or will, existing only to serve. Time lost coherence. I could not say how long I had been with the Penal Legion. Weeks, months, years. The campaign had no beginning or end that I could identify, just an eternal present tense of violence and exhaustion. My body bore the evidence of its passage. Scars that I could not remember acquiring, injuries that had healed badly, a persistent tremor in my left hand that might have been nerve damage or might have been the physical manifestation of everything I refused to feel. I looked at my reflection once in a puddle of water that had collected in a shell crater and did not recognize the face that looked back. It was the face of a dead thing, eyes empty, expression slack, animated by some force that could no longer properly be called life. Then, on a day like any other day, during an assault like any other assault, something unexpected happened. A shell landed close enough to kill me, but only collapsed the trench where I had taken cover, burying me under several meters of earth and rubble. I should have died there. Most people would have suffocated or been crushed, but the debris fell in such a way that it created a small pocket, an air gap just large enough for me to breathe. And I found myself trapped in darkness, unable to move, waiting for rescue that I knew would not come. The Penal Legions did not waste resources on recovery operations. If you fell, you stayed fallen. I do not know how long I was buried. Long enough for my water to run out, for hunger to progress past pain into a kind of distant discomfort, for my mind to begin the slow dissolution that comes with sensory deprivation. In that darkness, with nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the occasional rumble of artillery above, I had nothing to do but think. And thinking was the one thing I had spent decades trying to avoid. Memories surfaced, disconnected and non-linear. The child I'd been standing in the cathedral for the first time, feeling the weight of faith settling onto shoulders too small to bear it. The interrogator's red eyes watching as I confessed to emptiness. The faces of the faithful who had come to me seeking comfort and found only prescription. The woman with the scarred hands weeping as she thanked me for her punishment. I understood finally what I had done. Not the specific failures that had led to my condemnation, but the larger crime I'd been committing for decades. I had been a collaborator, a willing participant in a system of spiritual abuse, so vast that it had become invisible, normalized, accepted as simply the way things were. I had told people that their suffering was holy, that their oppression was necessary, that their desperation was a sign of moral failing rather than systemic cruelty. I had taken their pain and used it to perpetuate the very system that created that pain. And I had done it not because I believed. I had not believed in anything for years, but because I lacked the courage to refuse, because I feared the consequences of defiance more than I loved the truth. This realization did not bring catharsis or resolution. It simply was, a fact as solid as the earth that entombed me, as inescapable as the darkness that surrounded me. I could not undo what I had done. I could not make amends to the millions whose suffering I had rationalized and endorsed. There was no redemption available, no path to absolution, because the crimes I was guilty of were not violations of imperial law, but violations of something more fundamental, the basic human obligation to acknowledge the humanity of others, to refuse to be an instrument of their diminishment. The Imperium had no category for this kind of crime, because the Imperium was itself this crime writ large across the galaxy. A monument to the principle that human life has no intrinsic value, only instrumental worth, only utility in service to something that called itself greater, but was ultimately just the perpetuation of the machine. The oxygen was running out. I could feel my thoughts becoming sluggish, my consciousness narrowing to a point. Soon I would lose awareness entirely, slip into unconsciousness, and from there into death. It should have frightened me, but instead I felt only a vast relief. Finally, the performance would end. Finally, I would be released from the obligation to continue pretending, to go through the motions, to serve a God I did not believe in the name of an empire that existed only to perpetuate its own existence. Death would be honest in a way that life had not been for decades. Death would be the one choice I had made that was truly mine, even if it was a choice made only through the absence of alternatives. But then I heard sounds above me, scraping, digging, voices shouting. Someone was excavating the trench, not to rescue me specifically, but as part of some larger engineering project, moving earth to create new fortifications or clear lines of fire. It was pure accident that they found me, pulled me gasping and half-mad into daylight that seemed impossibly bright, laid me on a stretcher, and transported me to a field hospital where mechanicus servitors patched the worst of my injuries and declared me fit to return to service. I had not been granted even the mercy of death. The imperium had use for me still, and so I would continue. Because the imperium always continues, grinding forward not toward any goal, but simply forward, consuming resources and lives and souls in an engine that has long since forgotten what it was built to do, if it ever knew. I returned to my unit, or what remained of it, the faces different but the roles identical, and took up my laser gun and advanced when ordered. And this is what it means to worship the Emperor in Warhammer 40,000. To know that everything is pointless and cruel and wrong. To see the machinery of suffering laid bare in all its unnecessary complexity. And still to serve, because you have been built to serve. Because your programming goes deeper than your consciousness. Because the alternative is a void that terrifies you more than any torment the Imperium can devise. We are all slaves, and our slavery is called worship, and our worship is called duty, and our duty is eternal. And the only thing any of us can hope for is that one day the machinery will finally fail completely, that the Imperium will collapse under the weight of its own contradictions, and that in the ruins something better might grow. But I do not believe this will happen. The Imperium is too vast, too resilient, too skilled at converting resistance into compliance, dissent into devotion. It will outlive us all, this empire of suffering. And when the last human dies, it will die still praying to an emperor who never answered, still worshiping a system that gave them nothing but pain, still faithful to the bitter end. Because faith is all we've ever known, and knowing nothing else, we mistake it for love.